Hello everyone, my name is Daisy Brand, and today I'm going to be sharing research over exploring the impact of information load and need for cognition on attitude differences. I'm here at Fort Hays State University along with my faculty supervisor, Dr. April Park, and for this project we also worked with Ashley Lockwood, who is currently a graduate student at the University of Central Florida. So to get started with my presentation, I would just like to ask you all, what is one thing you don't think you could live without? It's something that allows you to communicate with anyone at any time. It allows you to find information in the matter of seconds right at your fingertips. It gets you where you need to go when you're in a new area and may be lost. And it's something that Americans spend approximately 5.4 hours a day using. If you thought of your cell phone, that is exactly what I want you to think of. Technology has become very prevalent in today's society, and with technology comes social networking sites and social media, and both of these have begun to play a very large role in our daily lives. When looking at statistics from 2020, you can see that 72% of the public use some type of social media. And with so much time spent on social media sites, it's quite inevitable that we will come across news while on them. And as social media expands, it just becomes an even more dominant resource for sharing and consuming news. About a third of American adults got their news regularly from Facebook in 2020, and 23% from YouTube and 15% from Twitter. And if you take a look at this graph, you can see the various other social networking sites that people have used to share and consume news. Looking farther into statistics over social media and news consumption, we can see that about 68% of American adults receive at least some news via social media. And when receiving news via social networking sites, it does come with complications. Incidental news consumption can happen when we come across news without any active search for the information, and this usually occurs based on algorithms used within social media sites. News-related information that we didn't intend on reading may just automatically pop onto our news feeds, and this can happen numerous times a day, so although we read through it, we don't thoroughly take the time to interpret and process the news. Additionally, information load can occur on social media when we have too much news arriving in too many different formats. This could represent itself as multiple sources with repetitive information, or it could just be one single source with extensive information included. And consuming too much information at one time can lead to diminished decision-making quality, confusion, and even frustration. So how does information load affect us today? What happens when we process all of this information? Are there benefits to the readers consuming it? What leads to long-lasting persuasive impacts? And are there similar impacts for processing a little versus a lot of information? These are some of the questions that we began to think about before looking into the influence that information load poses on attitudes. So taking a look at previous literature, it suggests that there is increased processing difficulty in sources with lengthier information or higher quantities of information, which requires a greater amount of processing resources. It also suggests that the strength of attitude change can differ when processing higher versus lower amounts of information. With higher quantities of information, it can lead to an increased persuasive impact, specifically when there is high processing motivation. However, with lower quantities of information, it can lead to an increased persuasive impact under low processing motivation only. Based on these findings, it is suggested that those with high personal involvement with presented issues are more likely to be persuaded by higher quantities of information, and those with low personal involvement with the presented issue are more likely to be persuaded by less information. So although we now know that differing amounts of information and their nature can influence our attitudes differently, we know that we're still likely going to be spending time online and consuming news that way today. So how may our propensity towards engaging in cognitively challenging tasks influence how we process the news that we see online? One question you may think to yourself is, how much do I enjoy thinking? So the need for cognition scale actually measures this. It measures one's tendency to enjoy thinking and the intrinsic motivation they take in mentally challenging tasks. As can be expected, those who are high in need for cognition are more likely to gather information, seek for a wide range of complex social issues, and form opinions. They are also motivated to process higher levels of information and more likely to show positive attitudes after receiving persuasive messages and maintain that held attitude over time. However, those in low need for cognition have varying degrees of threshold before experiencing cognitive fatigue, and they also have varying preferences toward tasks depending on the amount of cognitive complexity that they have. Therefore, it is possible for these individuals to form different attitudes after consuming varying amounts of information, specifically regarding social issues. Looking at more information that we know from previous literature, we can see that previous research has reported that citizens generally hold positive perceptions of law enforcement, while others suggest that trust in law enforcement is low and citizens tend to perceive police as being unfair. Due to the known conflicting perceptions regarding law enforcement among citizens and the prevalence of this topic within the media today, attitude towards law enforcement officers did serve as a topic for our new stimuli in our current study. And while positive results have been shown through local law enforcement's use of social media, the area still remains largely underconceptualized. Specifically, there's been little done to examine the role that information load on perceptions of an organization, and therefore we aim to explore that in our current study as well. We have also found that social networking site users may not be strongly influenced by the discussions that they see surrounding controversial topics on social media, and therefore they don't allow the information they view that does not align with their pre-existing beliefs to impact their already formed attitudes. This could be due to additional cognitive strain when attempting to process information that is dissimilar to one's existing beliefs, and it can cause consumers to selectively read information in order to diminish the effects of information overload, which was discussed earlier. So as we know, when we experience this, it can create impacts such as fatigue, irritation, and other emotional responses, especially when one is consuming news that opposes their already held ideas. The prevalence of overload can be attributed to the sheer number and variety of news sources and the limited time available to process them while we're endlessly scrolling through our social media. So for our current study, we explored the impact of information load on attitude formation through social media posts. They were all positively framed and presented decreases in sexual assault rates, and the quantities of information were manipulated to examine the relationship between the quantity of information and the attitudinal effects surrounding perceptions of law enforcement. Need for cognition was also measured, as we believe it would have pose effects on their attitude as well. So for our hypotheses, our first one was that individuals with high levels of need for cognition will display more positive attitudes toward legitimacy of law enforcement after reading positive passages about law enforcement. And for our second hypothesis, it was individuals reviewing high quantities of positive information will display more positive attitudes toward legitimacy of law enforcement. Taking a look at our method, we had a total of 106 participants, 68 were men, 38 were women, and the median age was 34.28. We utilized the shortened 18-item version of the Need for Cognition scale, and examples of measures on here where I like to have the responsibility of handling a situation that requires a lot of thinking, and it was measured using a 5-point Likert type scale with 1 equaling not at all like me and 5 equaling a lot like me. We also utilized the Attitudes Toward Police Legitimacy scale, which consisted of 34 items and was inclusive of multiple aspects contained within police legitimacy, such as trust and confidence, normative alignment, and community involvement of law enforcement. This was also measured using a 7-point Likert type scale with 1 equaling strongly disagree and 7 equaling strongly agree. Taking a closer look at our participants, a majority of them were Caucasian, followed by Black or African American, and Asian or Asian American. And majority of our participants also held a master's degree, followed by a doctoral degree, and then a bachelor's degree. So for our method, continuing, we created a series of messages that represent posts found in a diverse set of online media platforms. So for example, we used mock messages representing Facebook posts, posts from Instagram, Twitter, as well as online newspaper articles. All the messages described a decline in crime rates in a community. They described a decrease in sexual assault rates, so therefore they were all positively framed. And participants were placed in one of two conditions. In the low quantity condition, they received 2 mock messages, and in the high condition, they received 6. This is just an example of one of our stimuli used in our study. As you can see, it's supposed to resemble an Instagram post, and the user just wanted to share their appreciation for their community, as the police chief just announced a decrease in sexual assault rates, and they just believe that shows that they're ensuring that their community is a safe place to live. And as you can also see, there's a corresponding comment that is also positively framed. So for our results, the mean score for the need for cognition for our participants was 2.97, and Cronbach's alpha for the current sample was 0.88, indicating strong reliability. Participants were also asked to describe their political ideology, with 1 representing very liberal and 6 representing very conservative, and the mean score of this was 4.25 for our participants. To test the hypotheses, a multiple regression analysis was conducted. The overall multiple regression model was significant. However, neither of our hypotheses were supported. The need for cognition did not interact with information load and therefore did not predict attitudes toward law enforcement. And also, the high information condition predicted more negative attitudes toward law enforcement rather than positive as we originally hypothesized. This indicates that the participants formed more negative attitudes after reading heavier loads of positive information. So, since neither of our hypotheses were supported, why might this be? Cognitive dissonance may be one possible example for our rejection of the hypothesis that need for cognition would influence attitudes, and cognitive dissonance is a psychological inconsistency among one's cognitions. So, depending on the initial attitudes toward legitimacy of law enforcement for our current participants, they may have experienced these cognitive inconsistencies when reading highly positive news regarding local law enforcement. And holding these opposing perceptions and then reading high quantities of information that didn't align with their pre-existing beliefs may have caused an inverse effect on attitudes toward law enforcement. For the rejection of our second hypothesis, there are two factors that we believe may have played a role for our participants, including the Black Lives Matter movement or current social movements in general, as well as the demographic of our participants. The collection of data for the study took place only 2 short months after the death of George Floyd, which led to a global uproar in the Black Lives Matter movement. And this case of extreme police brutality may have impacted the overall impression of law enforcement for the participants in our study, allowing for a more negative attitude even after reading various positive messages regarding law enforcement. Another possible reason that our hypotheses could have been rejected was due to the participants in our study having low personal involvement with law enforcement. As discussed earlier with previous research looking at the quantities of information, only those with high personal involvement with presented issues are likely to be persuaded by higher quantities of information. So it may be that our participants had low involvement with this issue, specifically with law enforcement. Therefore, they would have needed lower quantities of information to have a more persuasive impact. This research shows that to prevent the experience of information overload and cognitive dissonance, it may be beneficial to consume online news in lower quantities as opposed to higher quantities in a given time period, as it may lead to more negative attitudes experienced by consumers. A primary limitation of our current study was the skewness of the sample. A majority of our participants were highly educated and held similar political ideologies. So as the sample was not representative of the entire population in terms of education levels or social views, future research should aim to reach a more diverse population to increase generalizability. Additionally, while the current study included likes, comments, and shares on the mock social media posts that we created for the surveys, individuals consuming this information in reality would likely see much more diverse comments and views and not all in support of the same positive opinion. Therefore, future research should emphasize this diversity among news on social media. Lastly, future research could also test the effects in conditions where the stimuli are neutrally or negatively framed. As noted, all the stimuli in our current study were positive, so more various perspectives may contribute to more unique findings in future literature. And while neither of the current hypotheses were supported, the results still provide insight for future studies investigating the impacts of social media use and perceptions among law enforcement officers. So in conclusion, due to the increasing amount of time that people spend online, as well as social media serving as a prominent resource for sharing information and news consumption, it is important to test how an influx of information influences our attitudes. We have found that possible negative side effects that accompany the consumption of information in an online format include information overload, cognitive fatigue, and cognitive dissonance. And to prevent these negative experiences, it may be beneficial to consume online news in lower rather than higher information conditions. And lastly, I just wanted to quickly add that it is important for both our mental and physical health to occasionally stop endlessly scrolling, put our phones down, take a step back, and take a deep breath. Enjoy what is presently around you rather than what is on your screen, as the information load may just be too taxing. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a great day.